There is a particular kind of quiet that surrounds anything that's actually being built. Not the quiet of nothing happening, but the quiet of something happening carefully, out of view, before it's ready to survive being looked at. A tree doesn't hold a press conference before it grows. A muscle doesn't announce itself before it's built. And most of the things we're proudest of later were, at some earlier point, small, unimpressive, and completely unspoken. That gap between the start of something and the moment it's strong enough to be seen is where most ambitions actually die. Not because the person lacked ability, because they let the idea meet the world before the idea was ready for it. Here's the pattern worth noticing. The moment a plan becomes a sentence you say out loud to someone else, it changes. It stops being only yours. It picks up a second life in someone else's head, filtered through their own doubts, their own experience, their own comfort with risk. You didn't ask for their opinion, but you'll get one anyway, because that's what happens when you hand a fragile thing to another person and wait for their reaction. Sometimes the reaction is warm. Often it's cautious, and caution, even well-meant, has a way of settling into your own thinking like sediment, quietly changing the shape of your resolve without you noticing it happening. This isn't an argument for isolation. It's an argument for sequencing. There's a right order to things, and talking has a place in that order, but usually much later than we're inclined to put it. Say the plan too early, and you risk trading the discomfort of uncertainty for the temporary comfort of being encouraged. That trade feels good in the moment. It rarely helps the work. Consider what actually happens in your mind when you tell someone about a goal you haven't started yet. You describe the version of yourself who has already changed. Leaner, richer, published, promoted, wherever the goal was pointing. You watch their face for a reaction. If they nod, if they seem impressed, something in you relaxes, just slightly, as though a piece of the goal has already been collected. That relaxation is the problem. It's borrowed satisfaction, taken out against effort you haven't put in yet. And like any loan, it has to be paid back, usually in the form of motivation that isn't there anymore when it's time to actually start. There's a story that illustrates this better than any explanation could. Years ago, I knew two people, both around the same age, both circling the same kind of ambition. They each wanted to build something of their own instead of working for someone else. The first one talked constantly. Every conversation eventually bent toward his plan. He had a name for the business before he had a product. He described the office he'd have, the team he'd hire, the launch he was imagining. People listened, mostly out of politeness, occasionally out of real interest, and every time they responded with encouragement, you could see something in him settle, like he'd already arrived somewhere. 18 months later, nothing existed. Not a prototype, not a client, not a single dollar earned. The dream hadn't failed loudly. It had simply evaporated, one enthusiastic conversation at a time, replaced eventually by a quieter kind of embarrassment whenever the subject came up. The second person told almost no one. For the better part of a year, she worked most evenings after her regular job, building something small and specific. A service nobody had asked her to build, aimed at a problem she'd noticed and couldn't stop thinking about. She didn't post about it. She didn't rehearse the pitch on friends. When people asked what she did in the evenings, she gave vague, uninteresting answers and changed the subject. By the time she finally mentioned it to anyone, she wasn't describing an idea anymore. She was describing something that already existed, that already had a handful of paying customers, that already worked. The conversation that followed wasn't encouragement for a dream. It was interest in a real thing. That's a different kind of attention entirely. And it only becomes available once there's something finished enough to earn it. The difference between those two people wasn't talent and it wasn't luck. It was where they placed the conversation in the sequence of the work. One spent his energy narrating the mountain before he'd taken a single step up it. The other saved her breath for the climb and let the view speak for itself once she'd reached a place worth describing. There's a reason silence protects momentum so effectively, and it has to do with where your attention actually goes. Explaining a plan and executing a plan draw from the same limited pool of focus. Every time you turn your goal into a story, refining how it sounds, defending it against a friend's polite skepticism, adjusting the pitch based on someone's raised eyebrow, you are spending energy on the narrative instead of the work. It feels productive. It has the shape of progress. But it isn't the thing. It's a rehearsal for a performance that hasn't happened yet, mistaken for the performance itself. This is worth sitting with, because most of us have felt that trade happen without naming it. You spend an hour describing your plan to a friend over coffee, and you leave the conversation feeling accomplished, energized, like you did something meaningful with your afternoon. But nothing changed. The plan is exactly as far along as it was before the coffee. What changed is that you spent your motivation on being understood instead of on being effective, and motivation, once spent, doesn't replenish instantly. You'll need it again tomorrow, and there will be less of it than there could have been. None of this means feedback has no value. It means feedback has a season, and the season is not the beginning. Early on, when an idea is still soft and unformed, it needs protection more than it needs critique. It needs enough uninterrupted time to take a real shape before it's tested against other people's frameworks for what's realistic or sensible. Ask for feedback too early, and you're not really asking for help. You're asking someone else to help you decide whether the idea deserves to exist at all, before you've given it a fair chance to prove that on its own. Ask for feedback once something tangible exists, and the conversation changes entirely. Now you're refining a real thing instead of defending a theoretical one. There's also a quieter cost to talking too soon, one that's easy to miss because it doesn't feel like a cost at all. It feels like connection. Every person you tell about your unfinished plan becomes, in a small way, a stakeholder in how that plan is discussed. They'll ask about it. They'll want updates. Some will ask out of genuine care, and some will ask in a way that feels more like checking whether you've failed yet. Either way, you've now created an audience for a performance that hasn't started, and some part of your attention will always be managing that audience, instead of doing the work the audience is waiting to hear about. The fewer people watching an unfinished thing, the more freedom you have to let it be unfinished, to be clumsy with it, to change direction, to abandon an approach that isn't working without that abandonment becoming a story someone else tells about you. Think about what it would mean to remove that audience entirely, at least for a while. No updates to give, no progress to justify, no one's expression to read for approval or doubt. Just you, the work, and whatever quiet, unglamorous effort the work actually requires on a given day. That is an enormous amount of freedom, and most people never experience it, because they've already spent that freedom explaining themselves before they've earned anything worth explaining. I think about this in terms of two different kinds of confidence. There's the confidence that comes from being told you're capable, and there's the confidence that comes from having already done something difficult. The first kind is fragile. It depends on other people continuing to say encouraging things, and it evaporates the moment someone doesn't. The second kind doesn't need anyone's permission to exist, because it's built from evidence you generated yourself in private without anyone cheering you on. When you work in silence, you're forced to build the second kind, because the first kind simply isn't available to you. There's no one clapping. There's only the question of whether you did the work today or didn't. And the honest answer to that question, repeated often enough, becomes a kind of self-trust that outside praise can never quite replicate. There's an old idea, easy to overlook, that results are their own announcement. When something is genuinely finished, genuinely good, it doesn't need much explaining. People notice on their own. They ask questions unprompted. The attention you would have had to manufacture through talking about your plan arrives naturally once the plan becomes a finished thing, and it arrives with a kind of respect that talking alone never generates. A business that works speaks for itself in its revenue. A book that's good speaks for itself in what readers tell each other about it. A changed body speaks for itself in the way a person carries themselves. None of that requires a narrator. It only requires that the thing actually exist. So here is the practical shape of all this. When you're at the very beginning of something, The idea stage, the first uncertain weeks. Protect it. Tell almost no one. Not because you're ashamed of it or afraid of judgment, but because it doesn't yet have the strength to withstand outside opinion without being changed by it. Let it take its natural shape in private. Do the unglamorous, repetitive work that no one will ever see and that never makes for an interesting conversation anyway. Save your explanations for later, when there's something real enough to explain. And when the moment finally comes to tell people, and it will come, because most good work eventually becomes visible whether you plan it or not, let it come from a place of already having done the thing, not from a place of asking permission to attempt it. There's a reason this pattern shows up so often in fitness goals specifically, and it's worth pausing on because most people have lived through some version of it. Someone decides to change how they eat, how they train, how they treat their body. In the first week of excitement, they tell everyone. They post about it. They talk about the program they're following, the results they expect, the transformation that's coming. For a few days, the attention feels like fuel. Friends comment. Family asks how it's going. And then the actual difficulty of the plan arrives, the tiredness, the boredom of repetition, the slow and unglamorous pace of real change, and the attention that used to feel like fuel starts to feel like pressure instead. Now there's an audience watching for the outcome, and every day that doesn't show visible progress feels like a small failure being witnessed. Compare that to someone who simply starts. No announcement, no program name shared, no picture posted. They wake up early because it's part of their day now, not because anyone's watching to see if they will. Months pass. The change becomes visible on its own, without a single update having been given, and by the time anyone asks, the person has already stopped needing the answer to matter to anyone but themselves. This is really a conversation about where a person's sense of proof comes from. There are two very different places proof can live. It can live outside you, in the reactions and opinions of other people, where it's unstable and depends entirely on their mood, their honesty, and their own unrelated insecurities. Or it can live inside you in the simple, private knowledge of what you did and didn't do today, which nobody can talk you out of, and nobody can inflate for you either. People who build the habit of working without commentary are, without necessarily realizing it, training themselves to trust the second kind of proof. And once that trust is built, it becomes far harder for outside opinion, support or criticism to knock them off course, because they were never relying on it to begin with. There's also something to be said about the emotional relief of not having to explain yourself while you're still figuring things out. Early on, most plans are messy. You don't know yet which parts will work. You'll try one approach, abandon it, try another, quietly change your mind about the whole direction more than once before anything stabilizes. That kind of exploration is healthy and completely normal. But it looks a lot like indecision from the outside, and if you've already announced a plan publicly, every one of those private course corrections turns into something you now have to justify to someone. Keeping the process private removes that pressure entirely. You're free to be wrong for a while. You're free to change your mind twice in a week without anyone keeping score. That freedom to be unfinished, unsure, and imperfect in private is often exactly what allows a good idea the room it needs to become a strong one. I want to be clear that none of this is about permanently withholding your life from the people close to you or treating every ambition like a secret to be guarded forever. There's a natural moment when sharing becomes appropriate, when a plan has enough shape and enough evidence behind it that a conversation about it is actually a conversation about something real rather than a hopeful guess dressed up as a plan. The skill worth developing isn't silence for its own sake. It's the judgment to know which season you're in, the private building season, or the season where the work has earned its own introduction. One more distinction is worth making before wrapping this up, and it's the difference between quiet confidence and quiet doubt, because from the outside they can look identical. Someone who isn't talking about their goal might be protecting it wisely, or they might simply be avoiding the discomfort of committing to it out loud, because some part of them doesn't believe they'll follow through. The test isn't whether you're staying quiet. It's whether the quiet is full of actual effort or empty of it. Silence paired with consistent, unglamorous daily work is discipline. Silence paired with nothing happening behind it is just another form of avoidance wearing a more flattering name. Be honest with yourself about which one you're actually practicing, because only one of them leads anywhere. There's a broader principle underneath all of this, and it applies well beyond any single goal you might be chasing this year. Attention is not a neutral resource. It has a cost and it has a direction. Every time you spend it explaining what you intend to do, you spend less of it doing the thing itself. That's true whether the goal is a business, a book, a physical transformation, or a quiet personal change that has nothing to do with anyone else's approval at all. The people who tend to finish what they start aren't necessarily the most talented or the most naturally disciplined. They're often just the ones who instinctively understood, maybe without ever putting it into words, that talking about a goal and achieving a goal compete for the same hours, the same energy, and the same fragile early motivation, and they chose deliberately to spend that limited supply on the work instead of on the announcement. The version of you that works quietly, without needing anyone to know yet, is very often the version of you that finishes, not because silence has some magical property, but because it removes the exit ramps, the small, comfortable detours into explaining, defending, and being praised for something that hasn't happened. Take those exits away, and there's only one road left, which runs straight through the work itself. That's a harder road to walk. It's also, almost without exception, the only one that actually arrives anywhere.